In the last 48 hours, there have been a series of drone and missile attacks on US military personnel stationed in Iraq and Syria. Terrorist groups affiliated with Iran have claimed responsibility, and on Monday, US time, in press conferences at the Pentagon and at the White House, the US government made it clear that they hold Iran generally and the IRGC specifically responsible for these attacks on US personnel. How much more evidence does the Australian government need before it acts on the IRGC, which is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, and lists it for what it is, which is a terrorist organisation?
Thanks, Senator. I'll ask Ms Chidgey to start. And obviously this has been a subject of consideration by parliamentary committees, and our advice about the fact that as a state organ, the IRGC doesn't come within the existing legislative framework. But I'll see if Ms Chidgey wants to add anything to that.
Senator, we have a responsibility for the terrorist organisation listing framework in the criminal code. As you know, there are sanctions regimes that Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has responsibility for in relation to the terrorist organisation listings. As we previously advised, as a state entity, the legislation does not provide for listing of the IRGC, given it is an organ of a state.
Yes, and your officials, it's a government policy question. It is not your responsibility to change policy. That's the responsibility of the government. But it appears very clear now that the IRGC is, as we have known for some time, engaging in overt financing, sponsorship and maybe even direct involvement in terrorist attacks. Why should a legal technicality prevent them from being listed as a terrorist organisation? Why should anyone be allowed to avoid the sanction of engaging in terrorism activities simply by being closely affiliated enough with a state entity to fail to meet that definition?
It's not a technicality, Senator. The legislation is constructed in such a way that it's not simply a matter of changing the definition. It would have other flow-on consequences. And as the government referenced in its response to a recommendation about the IRGC, that particularly looked at the steps it is taking, which are sanctions-related measures that Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are responsible for.
I understand the government's view and your advice that the Act as it's currently drafted prevents it from being listed, but there's nothing to stop the government from introducing amendments to the Act that would permit it to being listed. Why isn't the government willing to do so? And how much terrorist activity does a state entity have to engage in before that threshold is crossed?
Senator, it's not about the activity, it's about being an entity of a state, and the way the entire listing regime is constructed would mean there would be significant implications and a lot of complexity in changing all of that if it started to cover government entities.
Well, that's precisely my point. As you just said, it's not about their activity, it's their affiliation with a state or their involvement in a state. Well, shouldn't we be concerned with terrorist activity and the financing of terrorist activity and the encouragement of terrorist activity, no matter who is doing it, regardless of whether they are part of a state organ or not?
Senator, I'm not really sure that hinges on the listing regime. I've mentioned the other measures that the government has put in place. I'm not sure there's more than I can add to my answer.
Minister, perhaps it's better directed at you. Is there any activity that the IRGC could engage in that would be enough for the government to change its policy and take action and list them as a terrorist organisation?
I think the department have talked through the complexities of this. I think we've covered this off in previous estimates as well. I would note that the IRGC have been a malignant actor and threat on international security for a long period of time now. The previous government that you were a part of didn't list them. The reality is that they are a state actor. It's not something that is possible under the current legislation.
If Hezbollah sponsored and encouraged by Iran, launched attacks on northern Israel with their up to 150,000 rockets and killed many civilians, as many people fear that they have the ability and may yet do. Would that be sufficient for the government to change its policy?
Look, I think you're talking in hypotheticals, Senator Patterson, which is not always helpful to answer.
It's not a very far-fetched one, though, is it?
But we've explained the government position and the limits of the legislation. I've given you an answer about the position of the IRGC. That again, I'd reinforce that your government for almost 10 years didn't take the action that you're calling for now.
Well, I'll just repeat the offer that we've made both in writing and publicly to work in a bipartisan way with the government to change the legislation to allow this to happen. We are ready to assist the government if you choose to do so. Moving on